Part 1. The Urgent Call. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was deep in sleep after a grueling 14-hour shift at the hospital where I work as an ER nurse. When my phone rang with my sister Melissa's ringtone, my first thought was annoyance, but that quickly changed to concern. Melissa never called this late. "Hello?" I answered groggily. "Emma!" Her voice was breathless, panicked. "It's Dad. He had a heart attack. You need to come home right now. It's bad." I was instantly alert, adrenaline flooding my system. "Is he at Memorial? I can be there in 20 minutes. "No, he's at home. The paramedics are here. Mom's falling apart. Please, just come to the house, quickly." Without questioning further, I threw on clothes, grabbed my medical bag, and raced to my car. Our father had been in excellent health for his 65 years. Daily walks, decent diet, regular checkups, but heart attacks could happen to anyone. During the frantic 15-minute drive to my parents' suburban home, I mentally reviewed cardiac protocols and prepared myself for what might be waiting. The street was quiet when I arrived. No ambulance, no flashing lights. Strange, but perhaps they'd already transported him. I sprinted to the front door and burst inside without knocking. "Dad?" I called out, my voice tight with fear. "Mom, where is everyone?" I rounded the corner into the living room and stopped short. There sat my father, perfectly healthy in his armchair, sipping what appeared to be scotch. My mother, perched nervously on the sofa beside my sister Melissa and her husband Brad. My younger brother Kevin stood by the fireplace, looking uncomfortable. All eyes turned to me. "What's going on?" I asked, confusion replacing my panic. "Dad, are you okay?" My father cleared his throat. "I'm fine, Emma. Sorry about the emergency. We needed to speak with you urgently, and you haven't been returning our calls." I stared in disbelief, the reality of the situation slowly dawning on me. "You faked a heart attack to get me here?" "It was Melissa's idea," Kevin muttered, not meeting my eyes. Melissa shot him a glare before turning to me with a practiced, sympathetic expression. "We knew you'd come if it was an emergency. We've been trying to reach you for days." "I've been working doubles all week," I said, my voice hollow with shock. 3 major car accidents, a building collapse. I told you all I'd call when I could." "This couldn't wait," my mother interjected, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "It's about the trust fund." And there it was, the real emergency. 6 months ago, my maternal grandfather had passed away, leaving me, and only me, a substantial inheritance. $2.4 million to be exact. He'd been a successful business owner who sold his company at just the right time. And having watched me work my way through nursing school while supporting myself completely, he decided I was the only family member who shared his work ethic and financial sense. The decision had created an immediate rift in the family. My mother and siblings felt entitled to equal shares, despite having spent years barely maintaining contact with Grandpa, while I had visited him weekly, helped manage his care when his health declined, and genuinely enjoyed his company. "You got me here under false pretenses to talk about money," I said, attempting to process their deception. "Do you have any idea what you just put me through? I thought Dad was dying." "Now, Emma," my father said in his placating tone, "we understand you're upset, but we need to discuss this as a family. Your grandfather's decision wasn't fair to everyone." "Fair?" I repeated incredulously. "You lied about having a heart attack." "Please sit down," my mother urged, patting the seat beside her. "We have a proposal that makes sense for everyone." Still reeling from the bait and switch, I reluctantly sat in an armchair across from them, maintaining distance. That's when I noticed the folder of papers on the coffee table. Melissa leaned forward. "We've had a family attorney draft an agreement for redistributing Grandpa's inheritance. Equal shares for all of us. You, me, Kevin, and Mom. It's the right thing to do. And fair, added Brad, who had married into the family just 2 years ago, but apparently felt entitled to weigh in on my inheritance. I looked around the room at their expectant faces. You dragged me here at 2 a.m. after an exhausting shift, making me believe Dad was having a medical emergency, to pressure me into signing away my inheritance. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible, my mother said with a frown. We're just trying to correct an injustice. Your grandfather wasn't thinking clearly at the end. That was patently false. Grandpa had been sharp as a tack until his final days. His decision hadn't been made in confusion or haste, but after thoughtful consideration of how each family member had treated him and each other over the years. The papers just need your signature, my father added, sliding the folder toward me. Then we can put this whole unfortunate situation behind us. I glanced at Kevin, who at least had the decency to look embarrassed. You're okay with how they got me here? He shrugged. You wouldn't talk to us. What choice did we have? I took a deep breath, fighting back the combination of hurt, anger, and exhaustion threatening to overwhelm me. Part of me wanted to storm out immediately, but another part, the strategic part that had helped me navigate chaotic emergency rooms and difficult patients, recognized an opportunity. They believed they had me cornered, vulnerable, and outnumbered. They expected either capitulation or an emotional outburst. They didn't expect what came next. Let me see these papers, I said calmly. Reaching for the folder, my family exchanged victorious glances as I flipped through the legal document. The agreement would indeed split Grandpa's money 4 ways, $600,000 each. I noticed with grim amusement that it included a clause preventing me from taking legal action based on how the agreement was obtained. You need a pen? Brad asked, already holding one out to me. I looked up at their eager faces and made a split-second decision. Sure. As I took the pen, I could practically feel the collective relief in the room. My mother actually smiled, already mentally spending her share, no doubt. Melissa whispered something to Brad. My father poured himself another scotch to celebrate. I uncapped the pen and bent over the signature page, making a show of carefully reading the final clauses. Then I positioned the pen over the signature line and hesitated. Something wrong? My mother asked nervously. Just thinking about what Grandpa would say about all this, I said, pen still poised above the paper. About how you got me here tonight. He'd want the family to be treated equally, Melissa insisted. I nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Let me just. I made a motion as if signing, then suddenly closed the folder and set the pen down. Actually, before I sign, there's something you should all know, I said, my voice steady. Something Grandpa told me before he died. The bombshell. 5 pairs of eyes fixed on me. Curious, impatient, wary. What your elaborate scheme tonight has shown me is that Grandpa was right all along, I began. He told me that money reveals people's true characters, and that when he was gone, the family would show me exactly who they really are. My mother shifted uncomfortably. Emma, just sign the papers. It's late. He also told me something else, I continued, ignoring her interruption. Something about his will that none of you know. I paused for effect, watching their expressions closely. The inheritance I received has conditions attached. My father's brow furrowed. What conditions? There were no conditions mentioned in the will reading. Because they were in a separate legal document that only I and the executor are aware of, I explained. Grandpa set up the trust with a challenge clause. A what? Kevin asked. A challenge clause. It means that if any family member contests the will or pressures me to redistribute the inheritance, I gestured to the papers on the table. Like, for example, ambushing me with legal documents after faking a medical emergency, Then a secondary provision kicks in. The room had gone very quiet now. All celebratory energy evaporated. "What secondary provision?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I met her gaze directly. "If I'm pressured to share the inheritance against my will, I'm required to donate the entire $2.4 million to charity. All of it, not just my portion. The full amount. I don't get any, and neither does anyone else in the family." The silence that followed was deafening. 5 faces stared at me in varying stages of shock and disbelief. "You're lying," Melissa finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone. "Should I call Mr. Harrington, the executor, right now? I'm sure he'd be delighted to explain the legal ramifications of tonight's little scheme to all of you." I believe the term he used was coercion, which is specifically mentioned in the challenge clause. "Now, Emma," my father began, setting down his scotch with a shaky hand. "Let's not be hasty. We're just having a family discussion here." At 2:30 in the morning, after telling me Dad was having a heart attack, I reminded him. "With prepared legal documents? That's not a discussion. That's an ambush." My mother's face had gone pale. "You wouldn't really donate all that money, would you? Think of your future, your security." "I wouldn't have a choice," I explained calmly. "That's the point of the clause. Grandpa wanted to ensure his wishes were respected, no matter what. If I sign these papers, the executor is legally obligated to enact the secondary provision." Brad, always quick to calculate angles, looked skeptical. "If that's true, why would you even consider signing? You would have refused immediately." I smiled thinly. "Good question, Brad. I wanted to see how far you all would go. I wanted to give you the chance to reconsider, to realize what you were doing, to maybe show a shred of decency. And frankly, I was curious whether any of you would think to ask me what I intended to do with the money before trying to take it." They exchanged uncomfortable glances. "What are you planning to do with it?" Kevin asked tentatively. "Originally, I was going to set up college funds for Melissa's kids and yours when you have them," I said, nodding to my brother. "I was going to help Mom and Dad upgrade their retirement plan. I was even thinking about setting up a family vacation fund so we could all spend more time together." The stunned expressions around the room would have been comical under other circumstances. But now, I continued, rising from my chair. "Now I'm not sure. What I do know is that the decision is mine alone to make, as Grandpa intended. And after tonight's performance, I have a lot to think about." I picked up the folder and handed it back to Melissa. "I suggest you tear this up before you accidentally trigger the clause I just described." Grandpa specifically named several charities that would be delighted to receive $2.4 million. "Emma, please," my mother began, tears forming in her eyes. "We just wanted—" "I know exactly what you wanted," I cut her off, suddenly feeling the full weight of my exhaustion again. "And now I know exactly who you are, all of you." I turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "By the way, Dad, you might want to get a real checkup soon. Faking heart attack symptoms is tempting fate." As I walked out to my car, I could hear raised voices behind me, blame being assigned, recriminations flying. I drove home in silence, a strange sense of calm settling over me despite everything. When I arrived at my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto my couch, too wired to sleep despite my exhaustion. I pulled out my phone and dialed. "Mr. Harrington, it's Emma. Sorry to call so late, but I needed to talk to you about Grandpa's inheritance." "No, nothing's wrong. In fact, everything's exactly as he predicted." Part 3, the aftermath. The fallout was immediate and dramatic. By noon the next day, my phone was flooded with messages. apologies, explanations, justifications, and desperate attempts to determine whether I'd been telling the truth about the challenge clause. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I slept for 14 hours straight. The exhaustion of my work week combined with the emotional toll of the ambush finally catching up with me. When I woke, I made a decision. 2 weeks of silence. No contact with my family while I processed what had happened and decided how to move forward. My sister Melissa was the first to break. 3 days after the incident, she appeared at my apartment door, alone and without the confident demeanor she displayed during the ambush. "Can we talk?" she asked when I opened the door, her voice small. "Please." I considered turning her away, but ultimately stepped aside to let her in. She'd been my childhood confidant before money and jealousy had created distance between us. "Is it true?" she asked as soon as she was seated. "About the challenge clause?" I looked at her steadily. "What do you think?" She studied my face, then her shoulders slumped. "I don't know anymore. That's what scares me. I don't know if my own sister would lie to protect her inheritance, or if my grandfather really was that calculating." Interesting choice of words, I noted. Calculating rather than protective or wise. Melissa had the grace to look ashamed. It was so much money, Emma, and it didn't seem fair that he chose only you. Did you ever ask yourself why he might have made that choice? I asked quietly. Did you ever think about your relationship with him over the past decade? She looked down at her hands. We were busy with the kids, with our lives. We saw him at holidays. I saw him every week, I reminded her. I took him to doctor's appointments, made sure he was eating well, read to him when his eyesight started failing. Not because I expected anything, but because I loved him and valued his presence in my life. I loved him too, she protested weakly. I know you did, in your way, I acknowledged. But love isn't just a feeling, Melissa. It's actions. It's showing up. It's respecting someone's wishes, even when they aren't what you want. Tears filled her eyes. We really messed up, didn't we? The heart attack thing was my idea. I just knew you wouldn't come otherwise, and Brad said we needed everyone to present a united front. You could have tried honesty, I suggested. It works surprisingly well sometimes. Would you have come? I considered the question. Probably not at 2 a.m. after a double shift, but I would have talked to you eventually. That's what reasonable adults do. They talk. They don't manipulate an ambush. She wiped at her tears. So is it real? The clause? I smiled slightly. Does it matter? Either way, you now know I won't be pressured into giving away my inheritance. Either because I legally can't without losing it all, or because I'm standing firm on Grandpa's wishes. But we're family, she said plaintively. Yes, we are, I agreed, which is why what happened hurts so much. Families shouldn't treat each other the way you all treated me that night. After Melissa left, the rest of my family made their own attempts at reconciliation. My brother Kevin brought coffee and an awkward apology, admitting he'd known the scheme was wrong but hadn't had the courage to object. My father sent a formal letter expressing regret for his part in the deception. My mother left tearful voicemails about family unity and forgiveness. Only Brad remained defiant, sending a text suggesting I was being selfish and dramatic. When my self-imposed 2 weeks of contemplation ended, I invited everyone to meet me at a neutral location, a private room at a local restaurant, to discuss the path forward. To my surprise, everyone came, even Brad, though he sat with his arms crossed defensively throughout the meeting. Thank you all for coming, I began once we were seated. I've had time to think about what happened and what it means for our family moving forward. Before you say anything else, my father interjected, we want you to know how deeply sorry we are. What we did was inexcusable. It was, I agreed, but I'm not here to dwell on that. I'm here to tell you what I've decided about Grandpa's inheritance. The tension in the room was palpable as they waited for my decision. First, to clear the air completely, there is no challenge clause. Melissa gasped. So you lied? I created a consequence to match your actions, I corrected. I needed time to think without being pressured, and you all needed to understand how your behavior felt from my perspective. My mother looked both relieved and confused. So you can share the inheritance if you choose to? I can, and I've decided what I'm going to do. I opened my bag and pulled out several envelopes, placing them on the table. Inside each of these is a bank account number and initial deposit receipt. I slid one envelope to Kevin. This is a college fund for your future children, currently with $100,000. His eyes widened as he opened it and confirmed the contents. I pushed two more envelopes toward Melissa. Education accounts for Tyler and Emma, $100,000 each. Tears sprang to her eyes. You remembered what we talked about, naming the baby after you? I nodded and continued, sliding an envelope to my parents. This is a supplemental retirement account with $200,000. It should help with the renovations you've wanted to do and that European cruise you've been talking about. My father opened the envelope with trembling hands. Emma, we don't deserve this. It's not about deserving, I said quietly. It's about family. Grandpa wanted his money to secure our family's future, not divide it. What about the rest? Brad asked, ever focused on the bottom line. I looked at him steadily. The remaining $1.8 million stays in trust for now. Some will fund my own future, perhaps a house, graduate school, retirement. Some is earmarked for family emergencies, real ones, I added pointedly. And yes, some will go to charity, as Grandpa would have wanted. And what do you want from us in return? My mother asked cautiously. Respect, I said simply. Respect for Grandpa's decision to make me the steward of his legacy. Respect for boundaries. No more manipulation or ambushes. And most importantly, respect for each other as family members, not just potential beneficiaries of wealth. There was a long moment of silence as my words sank in. I think we can do that, Kevin said finally, looking more like the brother I'd grown up with than he had in years. As we finished our meal and prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside. Your grandfather would be so proud of how you handled this, she said softly. You're more like him than any of us realized. I know, I replied with a smile. That's why he trusted me with his legacy. Walking to my car afterward, I felt lighter than I had in months. The inheritance had indeed revealed my family's character, both the flaws and ultimately their capacity for growth. Grandpa might not have included a challenge clause in his will, but he had certainly left me with a challenge: to use his gift to strengthen our family, rather than allow it to tear us apart. Looking back at the restaurant where my family still lingered, talking more openly with each other than they had in years, I knew I was on the right path to meeting that challenge.